What happens when the most powerful spiritual leader in the world feels more alone than anyone else on earth? Pope Leo XIV was about to discover that sometimes the most profound answers come from the most unexpected places, and tonight would change everything he thought he knew about his sacred calling. The ancient marble floors of the Vatican's private papal quarters seemed to echo with centuries of solitude as Pope Leo XIV paced slowly through the dimly lit corridors, his white cassock rustling softly against the stone walls that had witnessed the prayers and anguish of countless predecessors. Each footstep reverberated through the hallowed halls like a heartbeat counting down the hours of another day, spent in the peculiar isolation that came with being shepherd to over 1 billion souls, while feeling disconnected from the very humanity he was meant to serve. The weight of his papal ring felt heavier tonight than usual, its gold band seeming to grow tighter around his finger with each passing moment. Leo paused before a towering window that overlooked St. Peter's Square, now empty save for the gentle glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the cobblestones where thousands had gathered earlier that morning for his weekly blessing. Through the glass, he could see Rome sprawling endlessly in all directions, millions of people sharing meals with their families, arguing about football matches, laughing at inside jokes, living the messy and beautiful reality of ordinary human connection that felt as foreign to him now as life on another planet. His breath fogged the ancient glass as he pressed his palm against its cool surface, watching the condensation disappear like his fleeting moments of genuine human warmth. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without first calculating the theological implications of their words? When had anyone last touched him with the casual affection of true friendship, rather than the reverent caution reserved for relics? The Swiss guards maintained their respectful distance in the corridors beyond, their presence a constant reminder of the invisible barriers that separated him from the world he longed to rejoin. Even his closest advisors approached him with a mixture of devotion and careful diplomacy that made authentic conversation nearly impossible. Leo turned away from the window, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that no amount of prayer seemed to ease, and for the first time in months, allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to simply walk out those doors as nothing more than a man seeking connection in the eternal city that stretched beyond these sacred walls. The rebellion began as a whisper in Leo's soul, growing louder with each step he took away from his private quarters and deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved through sections of the ancient complex that most visitors never saw, past storage rooms filled with centuries of ecclesiastical treasures and down narrow hallways where the marble gave way to simpler stone, worn smooth by generations of servants and clergy going about their daily duties. He had changed from his formal papal vestments into the simple black cassock and white collar of an ordinary priest. The transformation feeling both liberating and terrifying as he made his way toward a side entrance he had noticed during his early morning walks but never dared to use. The Porto di Sant'Anna loomed ahead, where Vatican employees and residents passed through during their daily comings and goings, far from the ceremonial gates where crowds gathered to catch glimpses of papal motorcades. The young Swiss guard stationed at the entrance straightened immediately upon recognizing him, despite the simple clothing, his eyes widening with the particular mix of reverence and confusion that came from encountering the Pope in such an unexpected context. Leo could see the questions forming on the guard's lips, the protocols racing through his mind as he tried to reconcile the sight of the Holy Father approaching this humble exit alone, unescorted, and dressed like any parish priest making evening. "Arounds, Santo Padre," the guard began, his voice carefully respectful but tinged with uncertainty. Leo raised his hand gently, offering the conspiratorial smile that had charmed cardinals and world leaders alike. "Just an evening walk, my son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority that made questioning impossible, while somehow feeling more human than papal. "Please, no escort tonight." The guard's training warred visibly with his instinct to follow proper security protocols, his hand moving unconsciously toward the radio at his belt before stopping mid-motion. Leo watched the internal struggle play out across the young man's features, recognizing the weight of responsibility that came with protecting someone whose very presence seemed to bend the normal rules of the world around them. For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance. Then the guard stepped aside with a respectful nod, his decision to trust papal authority over Vatican procedure opening the door to possibilities that neither of them could have imagined. As Leo passed through the gates, he felt the cool Roman evening air hit his face for the first time in months without the buffer of bulletproof glass, carrying with it the intoxicating scent of freedom and the promise of authentic human connection. Waiting somewhere in the ancient streets beyond, the cobblestones beneath Leo's feet seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of Rome itself as he stepped into the river of ordinary life flowing through the ancient streets. For the first time in years, he walked without destination or itinerary, letting his feet carry him along narrow passages that branched away from St. Peter's Square like arteries from a beating heart. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. He kept his head slightly lowered, partly from decades of habit and partly from the nervous awareness that his face had graced countless magazine covers and television screens worldwide. The last thing he wanted was to create a spectacle that would end this precious freedom before it had truly begun. Each time a pedestrian approached, Leo felt his shoulders tense with the fear of recognition, followed by the almost guilty relief when they passed by, with nothing more than a polite nod to what appeared to be just another priest making his evening rounds. A young couple hurried past, absorbed in an animated discussion about weekend plans, their voices carrying the musical cadence of Roman Italian that had always sounded like poetry to Leo's ears. An elderly man walking his small terrier offered a respectful "Buonasera, padre," before continuing on his way, the dog's tail wagging with the indiscriminate joy that came from simply being alive on a beautiful Roman evening. Each anonymous interaction felt like a small miracle, a return to the ordinary human experience he had lost somewhere between his elevation to cardinal and his eventual election to the chair of St. Peter. As he wandered deeper into the Trastevere district, the sounds of the city grew more intimate and inviting. Laughter spilled from restaurant windows, mixing with the distant echo of children's voices in hidden courtyards and the gentle murmur of couples sharing secrets on moonlit balconies. This was the Rome that lived and breathed beyond the ceremonies and protocols, the eternal city that had witnessed empires rise and fall, while ordinary people continued the sacred work of simply being human together. Leo's initial nervousness began to dissolve like sugar in warm wine, replaced by a growing sense of wonder at the beauty of unguarded human existence. The aroma of garlic and herbs drifted from kitchen windows, punctuated by the rich scent of espresso and the lingering sweetness of gelato from shops beginning to close for the evening. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Pope Leo XIV felt the possibility that somewhere in these winding streets he might rediscover not just his connection to humanity, but the very essence of what had first called him to serve. Turning down a particularly narrow street where medieval buildings leaned toward each other like old friends sharing whispered secrets, Leo discovered something that made him stop mid-stride. Tucked between a shuttered antique bookshop and a tiny florist whose metal gates were already drawn for the night, a small bistro glowed with the kind of warm, golden light that seemed to exist outside of time itself, the hand-painted sign above. The entrance read, "La Petite Lumiere," in elegant script, with smaller text beneath in both French and Italian that Leo could barely make out in the gentle illumination of the street lamp. Warm amber light spilled from the restaurant's windows onto the cobblestones, and through the glass he could see the soft flicker of candles on checkered tablecloths, creating an atmosphere that spoke not of tourist destinations or fashionable dining, but of the kind of place where strangers became family over shared meals and stories told in multiple languages. This wasn't the sort of establishment that catered to dignitaries or diplomats. There were no velvet ropes or uniformed doormen, no polished brass fixtures gleaming under expensive lighting. Instead, it possessed the unpretentious charm of a place that had been nourishing souls as much as bodies for generations, where recipes were guarded family secrets, and every chip in the wooden tables told a story of laughter, tears, and the countless small celebrations that make up a human life. Leo pressed closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered inside. An elderly woman with silver hair pinned back in an elegant chignon moved gracefully between tables, her movements carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of hospitality. She paused to adjust a young child's napkin with maternal tenderness, then shared what appeared to be a gentle joke with a middle-aged couple who responded with the kind of unguarded laughter that Leo hadn't heard in far too long. His hand moved, instinctively, to the simple wooden cross hanging beneath his collar as the rational voice in his mind whispered familiar warnings about security protocols and the complications that would arise if his presence became known. He could easily turn around, retrace his steps through the winding streets, and return to the Vatican, where a predictable meal waited in his quarters, alongside the comfortable isolation that had defined his existence for so long. But through the restaurant's windows, he glimpsed something that made his chest constrict with desperate longing. The elderly woman looked up at that moment, her eyes meeting his through the glass with curious warmth, and Leo realized he was standing at the threshold between the controlled world he knew and the authentic human connection his soul craved, more than his next breath. The brass bell above the door chimed with a crystalline note that seemed to suspend time itself as Leo stepped across the threshold into La Petite Lumiere. Immediately, the warm embrace of garlic, thyme, and slowly braised wine enveloped him like a childhood memory he hadn't realized he'd lost. The bistro was even more intimate than it had appeared from the street, with perhaps 10 tables draped in blue and white checkered cloth, wine bottles converted into candle holders casting dancing shadows on walls adorned with vintage photographs of the French countryside. The elderly woman he'd observed through the window looked up from where she was serving what appeared to be coq au vin to a young family, her graceful movements pausing as her eyes met his. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply regarded each other across the amber-lit space. Leo watched her weathered features shift from welcoming curiosity to dawning recognition, her mouth forming a small circle of surprise as she processed the impossible sight before her. Behind the narrow counter that separated the dining area from the kitchen, a man in his 40s with flour-dusted hands and the same elegant bone structure as the woman straightened from his prep work. His knife clattered against the cutting board as he followed his mother's stunned gaze. The other diners began to sense the shift in atmosphere, conversations trailing off as heads turned toward the doorway where Leo stood, uncertainty and hope warring in his chest. "Mon Dieu," the elderly woman whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her heart. Then, catching herself, she stepped forward with the natural grace of someone who had spent a lifetime making strangers feel welcome in her small corner of the world. "Bonsoir, mon père," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical accent of someone who had never quite lost the cadence of her native Provence despite decades in Rome. Leo felt the familiar panic rise in his throat, the instinct to flee before this precious moment of normalcy could shatter under the weight of recognition and reverence. But something in the woman's eyes stopped him, a warmth that seemed to see past his papal authority to the man underneath who was simply seeking a quiet meal and perhaps a moment of authentic human connection. "Bonsoir, madame," he replied gently, his voice barely above a whisper as he tested whether this fragile bubble of ordinary interaction might somehow survive. "I was hoping, that is, if you have room for one more tonight?" The woman's face transformed with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire bistro, and Leo realized that whatever happened next would forever change both of their lives. Marguerite guided Leo to a corner table with the same maternal authority she might have used to seat a beloved grandson, her weathered hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture so naturally affectionate that it made his breath catch. The simple wooden chair felt more welcoming than any of the ornate papal thrones he occupied during formal ceremonies, and for the first time in years, Leo found himself settling into a seat without considering the symbolic implications of his posture. "I am Marguerite Dubois," she said, settling across from him with the easy familiarity of someone who understood that good conversation required proper attention. "And that handsome devil in the kitchen is my son, Henri. We've been feeding hungry souls in this little corner of Rome for 23 years now, though our hearts never quite left the lavender fields of Provence." The mention of countryside struck something deep in Leo's chest. "I grew up in the hills outside Assisi," he found himself saying, the words emerging before his papal training could remind him to maintain appropriate distance. "My grandmother had a small farm there. I can still remember the smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings. Rosemary and sage, bread rising in the morning sun." Marguerite's eyes softened with recognition. "Ah, then you understand. The land, it gets into your bones, non? Even when life takes you far from home, you can close your eyes and still feel the earth under your feet." She gestured toward a faded photograph on the wall showing a stone farmhouse surrounded by endless rows of purple lavender. "That was my family's place in Gordes. 5 generations we worked that land before Henri's father brought me to Rome for love." Leo studied her face in the candlelight, seeing in her weathered features the same quiet strength he remembered in his own grandmother's hands. "Do you ever regret leaving?" "Regret?" Marguerite laughed, a sound like silver bells in the evening air. "How can you regret following your heart? Though I confess, there are mornings when I wake up expecting to smell lavender instead of Roman exhaust." Her expression grew more serious as she watched Henri move with practiced efficiency behind the counter. "But love creates its own landscape, you know. Here we plant different seeds, stories, friendships, memories, made over shared meals. It's another kind of harvest." As if summoned by their conversation, Henri approached with a basket of bread still warm from the oven and a small dish of olive oil that caught the candlelight like liquid gold. "Maman's philosophy," he said with obvious affection, "is that no one should ever leave our table hungry, whether for food or for connection." Leo felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest as the simple truth of those words settled over him like a benediction. Henri returned with a plate that made Leo's eyes widen in appreciation. Duck confit nestled beside roasted vegetables that still held the earthy sweetness of the French countryside, accompanied by a sauce that carried the complex depth of wine reduced with patience and love. As Leo took his first bite, the flavors transported him instantly to Sunday dinners of his youth, when food was prepared not just to nourish bodies, but to celebrate the simple miracle of family gathered around a table. "This is extraordinary," Leo said, and watched Marguerite's face light up with the particular joy of someone whose life's work had been recognized and appreciated. "The duck, it tastes like it was prepared by angels." Henri learned that recipe from his grand-mère in Provence, Marguerite said. though Leo caught a shadow passing across her features. Before she died, she made him promise to keep the old ways alive, even here in Rome, where everything moves so fast and people forget that good food requires time and patience. A young woman emerged from what appeared to be a storage room, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her hands dusted with flour. She moved with the same graceful efficiency as her father, though Leo noticed how she paused to glance at a stack of papers near the register, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "My granddaughter Celeste," Marguerite said with obvious pride. "She's studying at the Cordon Bleu, learning to be a proper chef so she can carry on what we've built here." But something in her voice suggested the pride was tinged with uncertainty. Henri and Celeste exchanged a look that Leo had learned to recognize during his years of pastoral counseling, the weighted glance between family members who were carrying a burden too heavy to share with outsiders. The young woman approached their table, offering a shy smile as she set down a small dish of what appeared to be lavender honey ice cream. "Grand-mère's secret recipe," Celeste said softly. "The lavender comes from seeds she brought from Provence. 40 years ago, we grow it in pots on the roof because—" She hesitated, glancing at her father. "Because we couldn't afford to maintain the little garden we used to have behind the building." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Leo watched Henri's jaw tighten with the particular shame of a man who prided himself on providing for his family, but found himself falling short despite his best efforts. Marguerite reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's hand, a gesture that spoke of comfort offered in the face of circumstances beyond their control. "Times have been difficult," Marguerite said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken worries that Leo suddenly realized had been present beneath her warm hospitality all evening. As if summoned by the weight of unspoken family concerns, a boy of perhaps 12 emerged from behind the kitchen counter, his school uniform rumpled and his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, clearly having just arrived from an after-school study session. He had Henri's strong jawline and Marguerite's intelligent eyes, but carried himself with the particular gravity of children who understand more about their family's struggles than adults realize. "Grand-mère," Marcel said softly, approaching their table with the careful respect of a child who had been taught proper manners despite the chaos surrounding him. "I finished my mathematics homework, and Celeste said I could help with the dishes before we close." Marguerite's face transformed as she pulled her grandson close, her weathered hands smoothing his dark hair with the automatic tenderness of a woman who had spent her life caring for others. But Leo caught the way her eyes lingered on the boy's worn school shoes, and the careful way she avoided looking at the stack of bills near the register that Celeste had been studying earlier. "Marcel has been working so hard," Henri said, pride and worry warring in his voice. "Top of his class in mathematics, and he wants to study business so he can help us expand the restaurant someday." The words carried the weight of dreams that might never have the chance to flourish. Leo watched as the family moved around each other with the practiced choreography of people who had learned to function as a unit in the face of mounting pressure. Celeste helped Marcel with his homework at a corner table, while Henri cleaned the kitchen with methodical precision, every movement speaking of someone trying to maintain dignity while his life's work slipped through his fingers like sand. "The landlord raised our rent by 60% last month," Marguerite said quietly, the words emerging as if she couldn't bear to keep them locked inside any longer. "We've been in this building for over 2 decades, watched this neighborhood grow and change, but now they want to put in another tourist cafe that will charge 3 times what we do for half the heart." Marcel looked up from his books at his grandmother's words, his young face serious with understanding. "Papa says we might have to move back to France," he said softly, "but I don't want to leave. All my friends are here, and I promised Grand-mère I would help her keep the restaurant going when I grow up." The simple faith in the boy's voice, his absolute certainty that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, made Leo's chest constrict with the recognition of what would be lost if this family's light was extinguished by the cold mathematics of modern commerce. As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, the other diners gradually departed with satisfied smiles and warm farewells, leaving Leo alone with the family whose story had become intertwined with his own in ways none of them could have anticipated. The candles had burned low on their tables, casting longer shadows that seemed to emphasize the intimacy of the moment and the weight of everything that had been shared. Leo reached into his simple black cassock for his worn leather wallet, the same one he had carried since his days as a young parish priest in the hills of Umbria. The gesture seemed to break the spell that had settled over their corner of the world, reminding everyone that this extraordinary evening would eventually need to bow to the ordinary requirements of commerce and transaction. Marguerite's hand shot out with surprising speed, her weathered fingers covering his wallet before he could extract any money. "Non, mon père," she said with the same gentle firmness she had used to insist he try the lavender ice cream. "Tonight, you are family, and family never pays." Leo looked up into her eyes, seeing there the same stubborn generosity he had witnessed in countless parishioners over the years, the widow who insisted on contributing her last euros to the church collection, the farmer who brought vegetables from his struggling garden despite his own meager harvest. It was a pride that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with dignity, the fundamental human need to give rather than always receive. "Marguerite," Leo said softly, "your kindness has already given me more than you could possibly know, but I cannot—" "You can and you will," Henri interrupted from behind the counter, where he was carefully wrapping leftover bread in brown paper for Leo to take with him. "Maman is right. This meal was our gift, our honor. To pay would make it something different, something less than what it was." Celeste nodded in agreement, her earlier nervousness replaced by the quiet certainty of someone who understood the deeper currents flowing beneath this conversation. "In our family, we believe that some things cannot be purchased, only shared." Marcel looked between the adults with the solemn concentration of a child witnessing something important, his young face reflecting an understanding that transcended his years. Leo felt the weight of their collective gaze. 3 generations of French hearts transplanted to Roman soil, united in their determination to preserve the integrity of what had passed between them. The recognition of their generosity, offered freely despite their own desperate circumstances, crystallized into something approaching divine inspiration in Leo's chest, and he knew that whatever happened next would change all of their lives forever. As Leo rose from the table, the family gathered around him with the tentative movements of people who sensed that something profound was shifting in the air between them. The warm glow of La Petite Lumiere seemed to pulse around them like a heartbeat, holding this moment suspended between what was and what might be possible. "Marguerite," Leo said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her eyes narrow. With sudden attention, "What if I told you that your generosity tonight, this gift of welcome, of family, of authentic human connection, has reminded me of something I had almost forgotten about my own calling?" She studied his face in the candlelight, her weathered features reflecting decades of experience, reading the hearts of those who sat at her tables. "I would say that sometimes the most important conversations happen over simple meals, between people who see each other clearly." Leo nodded, feeling the magnitude of what he was about to set in motion, settling over him like a mantle. "Then allow me to offer something in return, something that honors what you've given me tonight." He paused, watching understanding begin to dawn in her eyes. "I want to ensure that this place continues, not just for months or years, but for generations. Your lease, Celeste's culinary dreams, Marcel's education, the expansion you've talked about in whispers when you thought no one was listening. The silence that followed was so complete that Leo could hear the soft hiss of the dying candles and the distant murmur of Roman traffic beyond the windows. Marguerite's hand moved instinctively to her heart, her mouth forming a small circle of disbelief as the implications of his words began to register. "Mon père," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We couldn't possibly... That would be..." She gestured helplessly around the bistro, as if trying to encompass the impossibility of what she had just heard. "You fed me," Leo replied simply, his words carrying the authority of absolute conviction, not because you had to, not because protocol demanded it, but because it's who you are. You opened your door, shared your stories, welcomed me into your family without asking for anything in return. That is everything that matters in this world." Marguerite's eyes filled with tears that caught the candlelight like tiny prayers made visible. "But we are just a small restaurant. We are nobody special." Leo reached out and gently took her trembling hands in his own. "You are the reason I became a priest," he said softly. "You are what the church is meant to be. Love made tangible, strangers becoming family, hope served alongside every meal." The weight of his promise settled between them like a sacred covenant, transforming the humble bistro into hallowed ground. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Cardinal Bertoli's office as Leo paced before the mahogany desk, his usual papal composure replaced by an urgency that made his chief administrator's eyebrows rise with concern. The cardinal had served 3 popes before Leo XIV, but he had never seen such passionate determination focused on what appeared to be, from his perspective, a relatively small matter. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Bertoli said carefully, his fingers steepled over the leather portfolio Leo had handed him moments earlier. "While I certainly understand your desire to help this family, the amount you're proposing, the lease acquisition, the renovations, the business expansion, it's quite substantial for what is essentially a personal charitable gesture." Leo stopped pacing and fixed his administrator with a look that carried the full weight of papal authority. "Cardinal, this is not charity. This is investment in the sacred, in a place where the divine reveals itself through simple acts of love. I want this handled immediately, with the same priority we would give to any major Vatican initiative." Meanwhile, across the city in the narrow kitchen of La Petite Lumiere, Marguerite moved through her morning preparations with distracted efficiency, her mind replaying the impossible conversation from the night before. Had it been real? Had the Pope of the Catholic Church truly promised to save their failing restaurant? Or had the stress of their situation finally caused her to imagine miracles where none existed? Henri emerged from the storage room carrying supplies for the day's service, his movements careful and measured. "Maman, you've been stirring that sauce for 10 minutes without adding anything to it," he observed gently. "Are you still thinking about last night?" "I keep waiting for someone to call and tell us it was all a dream," Marguerite admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men like that don't appear in small bistros and promise miracles to families like ours." Cardinal Bertoli's phone rang at precisely 11 o'clock, interrupting his continued attempts to moderate Leo's ambitious plans. "Pronto?" he answered. Then his expression shifted to careful attention. "Yes, this is Cardinal Bertoli. I see. And the property owners are willing to negotiate? Excellent. Please proceed immediately." Leo watched his administrator's face transform from skepticism to amazement as the conversation continued, the machinery of papal influence beginning to move with the inexorable power that had shaped world history for 2 millennia. What seemed Impossible to a struggling French family was merely a matter of proper channels and papal determination to the Vatican's administrative apparatus. By afternoon, the first phone call would reach La Petite Lumiere, transforming doubt into wonder, and proving that sometimes the most profound miracles happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet application of love, backed by unwavering resolve. 3 months later, Leo found himself walking those same Roman streets again, but this time his steps carried the confident purpose of someone returning home. As he turned the familiar corner where medieval buildings leaned toward each other like old conspirators, he stopped in wonder at the transformation that greeted him. La Petite Lumiere had blossomed like a flower that had finally received proper sunlight and care. The hand-painted sign now gleamed with fresh gold lettering, while new burgundy awnings created an inviting entrance that seemed to beckon passers-by with promises of warmth and exceptional food. Window boxes overflowing with herbs released the scents of basil, thyme, and lavender into the Roman air. And through the expanded windows, Leo could see the restaurant's interior glowing with life. The original checkered tablecloths remained, but they now accompanied additional seating that somehow maintained the intimate atmosphere while accommodating twice as many guests. A small chalkboard beside the door announced Celeste's Daily Gelato, made fresh with love, in both French and Italian, and through the window Leo caught sight of the young woman confidently serving scoops of what appeared to be honey lavender, gelato to a delighted elderly couple. When Marguerite spotted him through the window, her face transformed with the radiant smile of someone whose impossible dreams had not only come true, but exceeded every hope she had dared to harbor. She rushed to the door, her movements as graceful as ever, but now carrying a confidence and joy that spoke of fears finally laid to rest. "Father Leo," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth of old friendship mixed with enduring gratitude. Come see what your kindness has built." As Leo stepped through the door, he was enveloped not just by the familiar aromas of garlic, wine, and herbs, but by something more precious. The unmistakable atmosphere of a place where love had been given room to flourish. Conversations flowed in multiple languages around him, punctuated by laughter and the gentle clink of glasses raised in toast. Henri moved confidently through his expanded kitchen, directing 2 new sous chefs with the quiet authority of someone whose passion had finally found proper expression. Marcel approached from behind the counter, now wearing a small apron and carrying himself with the pride of someone contributing meaningfully to his family's success. "Father Leo, look, I'm learning to make the bread now, just like Grandmère taught Papa when he was my age." The boy's face glowed with the particular satisfaction of someone whose dreams were taking shape through daily effort and love. Behind him, Celeste emerged from what had once been storage space, but was now clearly a professional gelato station, her movements confident and practiced as she prepared a small bowl of her signature lavender creation. "This is for you," she said, setting the gelato before Leo with a smile that carried echoes of her grandmother's gracious hospitality. "Made with lavender from our new rooftop garden. Grandmère says it tastes like Provence, but I think it tastes like hope." As Leo settled into what had become his regular corner table, surrounded by the warm buzz of a thriving restaurant and the loving attention of a family whose light had been saved from extinction, he understood with crystalline clarity that in preserving this small corner of authentic human connection, he had rediscovered the beating heart of his own calling. The most sacred act was not blessing multitudes from a distant balcony, but sitting at simple tables, sharing meals with strangers, who became family, one conversation at a time.